Welcome. Our top story tonight. Fresh rain and falling oxygen levels add to urgency to rescue operations for the youth soccer team trapped in a Thai cave. And the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Pyongyang, saying he hopes to fill in the details from the Trump-Kim summit agreement. You're watching The World. It's good to have you with us. I'm Girish Sawlani. Also tonight, the US and China implement billions of dollars of duties on each other's imports. So with everything from motor vehicles to soybeans targeted, are these the first shots of a global trade war? We'll have more on that later in the program. But first, there's been a tragic turn at the rescue site in northern Thailand, where crews are working to get 12 boys and their soccer coach out of a flooded cave. A volunteer diver lost consciousness while making his way out of the cave. The commander of the operation says the death has made them more determined than ever to get the boys out alive. Southeast Asia correspondent Liam Cochrane reports from Chiang Rai.
Every diving expert familiar with this operation knows how dangerous it is. Today we learnt how right they are. A former Navy SEAL who had returned to his old job to volunteer for the rescue mission died last night. He successfully delivered 3 oxygen tanks to the innermost parts of the cave, but lost consciousness on the 5-hour return trip.
The conditions in the cave are tough. After he delivered the oxygen tanks, Petty Officer First Class Saman passed out on his way back. His buddy tried to administer first aid, but he did not respond.
The death has been painful for everyone working to get the boys out, but the commander of the Navy SEALs says it will only make them more determined to succeed.
I can guarantee that we will not panic. We will not stop our mission. We won't let this loss of life be in vain.
The idea of the boys and their coach waiting weeks or even months for the rainy season to end has been dealt a blow, with concerns about the level of oxygen in their underground sanctuary. The other threat is the weather. There has been rain here today and there are real monsoonal downpours forecast for tomorrow. That could set the whole operation back weeks.
Preparations for a rescue have intensified. This is the path where rescuers have to guide 12 children and 1 adult, all inexperienced and some of them weakened by their ordeal. Even the higher parts of the cave are slippery and steep. The pumping has reduced the water level in some sections so the boys could wade or even walk. At other points they can keep their heads above water just. Elsewhere they'll have no option but to dive.
It will take 6 hours to get in and 5 hours to get out, because rescuers will be diving against the flow of water on their way in, so it will take more time.
For relatives outside the cave, the wait will be agony. They've got the world's best experts working hard to save their sons, and the rest of the world willing them to succeed.
And Liam Cochrane joins me now from the scene at Chiang Rai. Liam, given the tragedy that's happened, what's the mood among the authorities, the rescuers that have spent days preparing to rescue this group of 12 boys and their soccer coach?
Well, Girish, it's very much a different mood tonight than it was last night, when there was a lot of optimism that today would be the day that the divers would begin rescue attempts to get the boys and the coach, or at least the strongest of the group, out of the cave. But the tragic death of the former Navy SEAL diver has really reinforced what a difficult mission this will be, and just how risky it will be as the whole world watches, hoping for a positive outcome. But the preparations are ongoing, and there is no word at this point whether a rescue operation has begun. We believe it is not happening tonight, but we possibly won't know from the authorities officially when it begins until they have some good news.
So where are we at in terms of the preparations to extract the 12 boys and their coach?
Well, I just spoke to one of the volunteer divers who is going into the cave any time now. There's a fresh group of divers going in. Each shift, if you like, is a very long effort. It's 5 or 6 hours each way to get to the end of the cave to, in this case, to place more oxygen tanks, the precise task that took the life of the former Navy SEAL today. So those preparations are going on. They're still putting oxygen tanks along the way so that the rescuers and the boys have oxygen to breathe and also some backup supplies in case there's any problems along the way and they get stuck. So there is still hope that a rescue effort may come soon, and with the weather expected to be not very good tomorrow, heavy rain forecast, this still seems to be the best window that they've had since they found the boys.
So has the accident in any way altered potential strategies by the rescuers to go about the extraction?
No, fundamentally I don't think it has. I think the plan is still to try to walk them out, get them to wade through the water, and when necessary to get them to dive through the deepest parts. We were told yesterday that the trickier section will be a 200-metre fully submerged dive that the boys would have to do between the area known as Pattaya Beach and the Chamber 3 staging grounds, where supplies have been set up as a bit of a forward base. That seems to be the really difficult bit, but the whole thing is fraught with risks. We saw pictures, you may be seeing them as I speak, of the conditions inside the cave. It's extremely slippery. There is water still up to chest high on grown men, and in some places fully submerged tunnels.
And you spoke about the expected rains earlier. Are there real safety fears for the boys in the chamber that they're at, that the waters may rise quite significantly in that chamber?
Well, the real danger that the authorities have spoken about in terms of the boys staying in the chamber, there was, of course, consideration or theories that they could perhaps stay and just wait out the rainy season, which could be 4 months or even longer. The concerns that have come out in the last 24 hours are over the oxygen levels, which are reportedly dropping. There are efforts to try and get a line in to pump oxygen into that far cave, 4 kilometres or so into the cave complex. We don't believe that has happened yet, but that is a priority for rescuers to try and get more oxygen into that underground sanctuary so the boys can stay if they're not able to dive out, especially if rains come tomorrow as forecast. That will make diving out an even more difficult option.
Okay, Liam Cochrane in Chiang Rai, thanks very much for the update. Well, Thai rescuers say the death toll from a boat accident near Phuket could rise to nearly 60. 27 people have been confirmed dead after a boat carrying Chinese tourists capsized in rough waters. Navy divers are searching for 29 missing people, but they say the fears that there is no chance of any more survivors. Sophie Malcolm reports.
With a rising death toll, these divers face an arduous task, finding dozens of other passengers still missing.
The tourist boat is on the seabed now. We found it with a sonar scan by a HMS Long Long vessel. We are sending divers to the location now.
A boat capsized in 5-metre waves on Thursday night. Another in the area also capsized, with 2 passengers from that boat still missing. The 2 boats were carrying 127 Chinese tourists and overturned on the way back to Phuket Island. The Chinese consulate says it sent officials to help in the search.
After the incident happened, the Chinese consulate immediately activated its emergency response mechanism and quickly sent staff to the scene of the disaster. We urge the Thai side, the local government, Coast Guard, Navy and other departments to proceed with the search and rescue work.
Thailand is in the midst of monsoon season, which begins in May and usually ends in October, bringing high winds and flash storms to coastal areas.
We have given warnings through radio and notified the press yesterday, but the winds are strong.
Authorities said they would consider whether to ban boats from going to sea during strong winds. Thailand has a poor record when it comes to road and boat safety, and many tour operators have complained about lax enforcement when it comes to basic safety measures, including life jackets on boats. Chinese tourists make up the biggest foreign visitors to Thailand, with numbers surging in recent years due to the increasing popularity of Thailand's islands. Sophie Malcolm, ABC News.
The U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has met with North Korean officials, saying he hopes to fill in details on how to dismantle the country's nuclear program. Pompeo met Kim Yong-chol, who played a key role with Pompeo in arranging last month's summit between U.S. President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Pompeo's talks with Kim were expected to last a couple of hours. It's not certain whether he will meet with Kim Jong-un. The former leader of the Japanese doomsday cult that carried out a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway in 1995 has been executed. The cult leader Shoko Asahara, along with several followers, were hanged for their role in Japan's worst terror incident, which killed 13 people and injured thousands more. Andrew Thompson reports.
This is the face of the mastermind behind a series of crimes in Japan, including simultaneous sarin gas attacks on Tokyo subway trains during peak hour in March 1995.
These criminal acts, which took place for the long duration, were planned and conducted systematically. They were the incidents which were unprecedented, at the same time extremely violent and grave, so that they should never be repeated in future.
Images of the aftermath of the attacks shocked the nation, and his execution has brought closure for some.
I feel that the fact that the defendant himself or the top of the cult was executed is the end of the era, and it also makes me feel old.
While for others, it didn't come soon enough.
Thinking of those who passed away, in my case, they are the parents of my husband, my parents, and others who are already gone, and that they could not hear of this news of the execution. That is my regret.
Born Chizo Matsumoto in 1955, Asahara founded Shinrikyo, or Supreme Truth, in the mid-1980s. The group attracted young people disillusioned with the modern materialistic way of life.
Matsumoto conducted criminal acts repeatedly and in a long duration, and carried on without any control or restraints until he got to the indiscriminative mass murder by controlling many of his subordinates so that they could conduct systematic and planned criminal acts.
Asahara and 5 of the 6 executed were implicated in the subway attack. Their execution had been postponed until all those convicted had completed their final appeals. 6 other followers remain on death row. The cult also carried out other crimes that, together with the subway attack, killed 27 people in total. Andrew Thompson, ABC News.
In the UK, 2 people poisoned by the nerve agent Novichok may have come into contact with a container used in a previous attack. The couple were drug users, and Britain's Home Secretary says they might have found a contaminated vial or syringe. The UK has accused Russia of turning the country into a dumping ground for poison, something Moscow angrily rejects. Here's Chief Foreign Correspondent Philip Williams.
This is CCTV footage of Dawn Sturgis at a local shop last Friday. A day later, she was in a hospital bed in a desperate condition. Hours later, her friend Charlie Rowley was also overcome by the Novichok nerve agent.
He's my younger brother. I love him to bits. I don't want anything to happen to him.
Police now think it's likely these victims have come in contact with an as yet unidentified object, such as a vial or container that may have been connected with the first Novichok attack. That was against former Russian agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in the same area just 3 months ago.
It doesn't surprise me that they're still in the environment 4 months after use, because work I've done showed the presence of agents 4 years after they had been used.
A number of locations have been cordoned off as specialist police comb the areas for vital clues. Police can't guarantee everyone's safety, but don't want people to panic.
I understand that people in Amesbury and Salisbury will be concerned about this incident. I would, however, like to reassure you that it is safe to continue with your daily business.
The British government's Emergency Cobra Committee met today to discuss the crisis, but were unequivocal, accusing the Russians of responsibility.
It is completely unacceptable for our people to be either deliberate or accidental targets, or for our streets, our parks, our towns to be dumping grounds for poison.
But the Russian government is demanding an apology for what they claim are outrageous lies coming from London.
We call on Theresa May's government to stop its intrigues and games with chemical agents.
Relations between Russia and the UK were already at a low after the first Novichok attack. Now they're likely to sink even further. Philip Williams, ABC News, London.
Hackers based in China have infiltrated one of Australia's most prestigious universities, and the threat is yet to be shut down. ABC News has been told the Australian National University system was first compromised last year. The ANU says it's been working with intelligence agencies for several months to minimize the impact of the threat. Attempts to lock out the hackers are continuing. You're with The World. Still to come on the show, a close encounter with a grizzly for 3 hikers in Western Canada. A reminder of our top story tonight. Rescue teams in Thailand say they are more determined than ever to get 12 boys and their soccer coach out of a flooded cave alive after a volunteer diver died at the site. The diver lost consciousness while making his way out of the cave during the operation. China and the US have imposed a tit-for-tat duties on $34 billion worth of each other's imports after China said it was responding to unfair tariff increases from the US. Hours before Washington's deadline for tariffs to take effect, US President Donald Trump warned the US may ultimately target $500 billion worth of Chinese goods. China's Commerce Ministry released a statement saying it was forced to retaliate, meaning $34 billion worth of goods, including auto and general agricultural products, will attract 25% tariffs. Well, Andrew People is the Asia Markets editor for the Wall Street Journal. He's been closely watching every volley and broadside in this so-called trade war, and he joins me now from Hong Kong. Andrew, thank you very much for your time this evening. Firstly, can I get a sense of the market reaction to these trade tariffs being imposed by both Beijing and Washington?
Well, perversely, today actually stocks in China went up, but that's a bit of a change of the recent pattern. We've seen the stock market here in China fall pretty sharply over the last few weeks as this trade war has escalated. Over in the States, not quite so much of an effect. Obviously, that's an economy that's quite largely domestically reliant, so not so much of an impact so far in the US. But here in China, both the currency and the stock market have been suffering in recent weeks quite a lot.
Now, China and the US have somewhat different targets for these tariffs. The US is targeting Chinese construction machinery, agricultural machinery, and then from Beijing's side is US pork and soybeans. What do you read into how both Beijing and Washington are targeting this first round in this trade war?
I think from the US side, what's interesting is that so far they're mostly targeting the sort of products that businesses buy from each other. They're not really targeting the sort of products that consumers like you and me buy, iPhones, clothes, toys, that kind of thing. I guess that is because at this stage, the US wants to make sure that consumers aren't hit too hard. Obviously, there's some big elections coming up later in the year in the US, and maybe they have that in mind. On the China side, what's interesting is targeting these agricultural products really hits the US hard in the states that have been strong supporters of Donald Trump, some of those Midwestern states that grow a lot of crops. Some analysis by Moody shows that those states are the ones that are going to be hardest hit. So obviously the Chinese are trying to hit Trump and the US where it's going to hurt the administration the most.
So when will people and the businesses linked with these industries begin to feel the pinch?
Well, so far, to be honest, 34 billion's worth of goods with tariffs slapped on each other. You know, that sounds like a lot of money, but in terms of, for example, the US imports around $500 billion worth of goods from China each year. And economists expect that even for the Chinese economy, the effect of this is going to be quite small, probably, if we stay at this sort of level, maybe 0.1, 0.2 off China's growth this year. Where it will start to ramp up, I mean, Mr. Trump there saying $500 billion worth of goods could eventually have tariffs. Well, that's practically all the goods that America imports from China. So, that is going to hit consumers hard in the pockets. All those goods that we've gotten used to getting cheaper over the last few years as China has come into the world economy, then prices could start to rise as businesses pass on those costs to consumers like you and me.
Now, the US buys more of what China has to offer more than the other way around. So who stands to lose out in this?
Yeah, on paper, it's, the US starts from a strong standpoint. As I said at the top there, the US economy will probably take less of a direct hit from this than the Chinese economy. But, world trade has become so complex in the last few decades with global supply chains. And so, you'll see indirect impacts, for example, on American businesses. Take Apple, for example. They sell a lot of iPhones in China. There could be some retaliation there that the Chinese impose, where they, make it harder for Apple to do business in China, both selling its iPhones or, make it harder for the companies that make the parts that go into iPhones. So, how this actually plays through is going to be incredibly complicated. And it's not quite as easy as just saying, well, the US imports more from China, therefore the US stands to win here. It could come through in lots of different ways that we don't quite anticipate yet.
Now, Donald Trump is threatening $500 billion of tariffs on Chinese goods. Do you perhaps see this as a game of who's going to yield first?
Yeah, look, I think at its very broad level here, and it depends how far the Trump administration takes this. I think there are people in the Trump administration who see this as a real chance to take on the Chinese economic model. China over the last few years has benefited from having a lot of state support for its companies, cheap loans, some subsidies. It's protected its domestic industries. And that's a model that some in the Trump administration have basically turned around and said, look, we just can't deal with this anymore. It's hurt our own businesses here in America too much. The benefits we've felt from having cheap goods coming from China are now being outweighed by the losses we feel from jobs here in America. That's the key question now. Will those people in the Trump administration get the upper hand? In which, if they do, then things could escalate. There are other people in the Trump administration who have more limited aims here. They simply want the Chinese to buy more American goods, more American oil and gas, for example. So it really depends now on kind of who wins through in that internal debate in America. And frankly, the Chinese themselves, I think, are quite confused as to where this is headed. They're not quite sure how to read what's going on in Washington themselves.
And on that point, what are your expectations in the medium to short term? Will this trade war escalate in small steps as we've seen today?
I think so. I mean, most trade wars, either they go one round, and here we are in round one, or they do carry on over a number of years. I mean, I think that, when you look at the broad sweep of history here, the last 30, 40 years have essentially seen the West, led by the US, wanting to accommodate China's rise, partly because it's led to a lot of cheap goods for us, and partly because if 1 billion people are emerging into the world economy, it's better to do that in a peaceful way. The fact that there are plenty of people now in America who have sort of come to the end of their tether with that approach is a big shift, and that's where I'm worried that this could drag on for a number of years, and it could spread across administrations. A lot of people worry about Trump, but there are plenty of people in the Democratic Party in the US on the left who kind of agree with some of the steps he's taking here. So this could be something that goes across party.
Okay, Andrew People, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Pakistan's former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif has been sentenced to 10 years prison by an anti-corruption court. Sharif was ousted from power in July last year over corruption allegations connected to the Panama Papers scandal. The court accused Sharif and his family of being unable to legitimately show the money trail for the purchase of several luxurious properties in London. Sharif's daughter Mariam, widely seen as his chosen political heir, was sentenced to 7 years. Both are currently in London and deny any wrongdoing. They are expected to appeal. The head of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has resigned after coming under fire for a number of ethical scandals. Scott Pruitt had rolled back a number of environmental regulations while heading the organization. But he's been under scrutiny for months over allegations of travel rorts, improper dealings with lobbyists and other issues. Here's North America correspondent Connor Duffy.
As a climate change skeptic in charge of an environmental protection agency, he'd become a figure of ridicule. Even restaurants weren't safe in the end for Scott Pruitt.
I would urge you to resign before your scandals push you out.
Today he took that advice, resigning amid the pressure of more than a dozen ethics investigations. The president didn't mention him at a rally for the faithful in Montana, but tweeted his thanks. Within the agency, Scott has done an outstanding job, and I'll always be thankful to him for this. Scott Pruitt's list of transgressions was long. He's accused of spending a fortune on first-class travel and security, accepting cheap accommodation from lobbyists, installing a $43,000 soundproof booth in his office, and ordering staff to run personal errands, like taking a mattress from one of Trump's hotels for his spare room. He'd even drawn the ire of Republicans and the usually friendly territory of Fox News when he pushed through huge pay rises for friends on staff.
They did not get a pay raise.
They did?
No, they did not. They did not. I stopped that yesterday.
So you stopped it?
Yeah.
Are you embarrassed?
He moved to slash environmental regulations and promote coal, a stance that saw the president defend him even as scandals mounted.
I'm not happy about certain things, I'll be honest. Excuse me. I'm not happy about certain things, but he's done a fantastic job running the EPA.
There was no apology in Scott Pruitt's resignation letter, and he said he was leaving reluctantly. The unrelenting attacks on me personally, my family, are unprecedented and have taken a sizable toll. Despite the resignation being welcomed by both sides of politics, the direction of the EPA is unlikely to change. The new temporary boss is a former coal lobbyist, and critics say the regulator will continue to be run by a leader who doesn't want it to exist in the first place. Connor Duffy, ABC News, Washington.
Well, there's been a changing of the guard at the top of Australia's military. Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin has just had his final day on the job, and he's warned of the growing threat posed by Beijing's militarization in the South China Sea. He spoke with defense reporter Andrew Green.
The roar of fighter aircraft has been the soundtrack to his 40-year military career. Now this former Navy and Air Force pilot has officially handed over command of the ADF.
The security environments are not getting less complex.
In his time at the top, Mark Binskin's overseen Australia's combat operations in Afghanistan and the transition to a training and support mission.
The Afghan people need continued support for a while to come to be able to deliver on a level of security.
But security concerns closer to home remain front of mind.
This is the Chinese levy.
While not specifically naming China, the departing defence chiefs highlighting the rapid militarisation of crucial trading waters to Australia's north.
The complexity in the South China Sea is something that concerns us. Any nation that might not be transparent in what they're doing is a concern to us.
Concerns over China's growing regional influence are also shared across the Tasman. For the first time, New Zealand has publicly pointed to the threats posed by Beijing's activities in the Pacific. And the Kiwis are warning that smaller nearby nations may need to rely more on Australia to contribute to their security. In Wellington, the latest strategic defence policy statement has just been released, and China's recent activities feature prominently.
There are some things that are not conducive to peace and stability that raise opportunity for miscalculations that are unhelpful.
Now the task of ensuring Australia avoids any miscalculations falls to a new defence chief.
It is a privilege. It carries a significant burden of responsibility.
leading a force of 80,000 uniformed Australians. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, 3 hikers in Western Canada have barely escaped a close encounter with a grizzly. The Australian couple and a Canadian friend were filming on a wilderness trail when they came across a bear on the track.
Stay there, Barry. Don't follow us. Don't come towards us. I don't want to use my bear spray.
Well, one of the hikers says it took him a while to realize what it was before backing up.
That's a good boy. That's a good boy. Crap, he's huge.
The grizzly turned and made a loop around the hikers. Wildlife experts say the group handled the situation well and did the right thing by remaining calm and staying together. Always good advice. Well, still to come on the show, dozens killed in a blast at a fireworks warehouse in Mexico. You're watching The World. The top stories we are following tonight. A volunteer diver has died in the rescue mission to save 12 boys and their soccer coach from a cave in Thailand. The diver was placing oxygen canisters along the route to get the children before he lost consciousness. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has met with North Korean officials, saying he hopes to fill in details on how to dismantle the country's nuclear program. Pompeo met with Kim Jong-chol, but it's uncertain whether he will meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And 33 people have died after a tourist boat capsized in rough seas off the island of Phuket. Search teams are still looking for almost 23 people missing after the boat sank in 5-meter waves. Well, the full horror of how a Sydney man murdered his 2 teenage children is becoming clearer tonight. Police have revealed John Edwards bought 2 guns and shot his 13-year-old daughter and 15-year-old son in a premeditated attack. The children were at the centre of a prolonged and bitter custody battle. Here's Mark Reddy.
Before dawn, police surrounded the house in Normanhurst, where they believed the still-armed father was holed up.
The police and your house is surrounded. You need to walk to the front door with your hands in the air.
Terrified neighbours woke to the blare of police loudspeakers and spotlights shining in their gardens.
We heard police saying words like, please come out of the house and have your hands above your head.
Unbeknown to officers, the man was already dead from a gunshot wound. The final act in what police say was a premeditated attack.
This was a planned activity on the part of the 68-year-old male, and we are of the belief that shortly thereafter he's attended the address at Normanhurst and taken his own life.
His 15-year-old son and 13-year-old daughter were home alone after school at the house in West Pennant Hills, where they lived with their mother. Their father, 68-year-old John Edwards, arrived at the house armed with 2 handguns. Several shots were heard by neighbours who alerted police.
We were at home and my son was watching a movie and we thought the sounds were coming from the movie. I all of a sudden was receiving text messages, phone calls from people saying, "Do you know what happened? Are you okay?"
The bodies of the 2 teenagers were found in their rooms. Their mother arrived home from work shortly after.
A 36-year-old woman attended the scene suffering from significant shock, and I can't even imagine the stress and the heartache that she's going through.
She'd been in a long custody dispute with her former partner, who worked as a financial planner.
The details about the nature of the relationship, particularly in recent times, and the level of access that the 68-year-old had to his children, is subject of investigation.
Police say there were no AVOs in place, but the man was known to them.
Police say 2 handguns were found in the same house as the man's body. They were bought and registered earlier this year, evidence of what they say was a premeditated attack.
Support was provided for friends and teachers. Their schools expressed sympathy to the family. This afternoon, the father's body was removed from the house as police investigate what led him to commit such a terrible act of family violence.
Well, Federal Parliament's longest-serving MP, Jenny Macklin, has announced she's retiring from federal politics after nearly 23 years. The well-respected Labour MP played a pivotal role in the apology to the stolen generations and in establishing the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Former Prime Minister Julia Gillard tweeted praise for her work on social reforms, and Deputy Leader Tanya Plibersek said she had helped many people.
Jenny Macklin has had a huge influence on the lives of millions of Australians, and she's done it always with the thought of the people that she went into Parliament to stand up for.
The 64-year-old has represented Jagga Jagga in Melbourne's northeast since 1996. Her retirement follows backbencher Michael Danby yesterday. A feverish pre-selection battle over who will succeed them is to be expected. Well, the Turnbull government has this week come up with a new GST carve-up. WA gets a greater share, but the other states don't lose any. An interesting mathematical equation, as Insider's Barry Cassidy explains.
Horizontal fiscal equalisation. OK, it's not exactly clickbait material, but it is time to talk about it nevertheless. So first, what is it? Well, it relates to how GST money is carved up between the states. Equalisation is the key word. The money is handed out according to a formula that means no matter the economic conditions in each of the states, they can in the end provide the same standard of services. In other words, the wealthier states prop up the less wealthy. All good. But in recent times, the formula has failed, and Western Australia in particular was getting a raw deal. So how to fix it with the other states not losing money? Well, believe it or not, the federal government has found a way. Yeah, really. A solution where everybody is a winner. And they've done that by throwing federal money at the problem. Rather than just rely on money raised through the GST, they'll tip in some money of their own, a federally funded top-up. Now, this really is quite a radical approach, and it's not without its problems. Because federal money, quite separate to the money raised through the GST, is now involved, then future governments could be hostage to fresh horse trading, negotiations that'll go on for ages, and that could get very sticky indeed. And apart from that, it throws up the same questions that cloud the personal income tax cuts. Governments committing to spend many billions years from now when an economic downturn could make that spending unaffordable. But bottom line, this has been a vexed and difficult question for successive governments. The system has needed tweaking for a long time now, and finally it's happened. OK, it's a political fix, but as political fixes go, it's not a bad one.
A UN peace envoy is desperately trying to broker a deal which would stop an all-out assault on the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah. Aid groups say the ongoing fighting puts lives of 600,000 residents at risk. As many flee the fighting, food and water are in short supply. A short time ago, I spoke with Muhsin Siddiqui, the Oxfam country director for Yemen. He says the situation in Hodeidah is getting desperate.
Little drop in the intensity of fighting is still the fate of over 600,000 people in Hodeidah hangs in the balances. If you walk, you can see that the streets are empty. The shops, bakeries been closed. Already 80,000 people have fled the city. You can see that the snipers and the jets are in the air. And in the street you can see barricades, and one party is patrolling with pulls of heavy weapons. The people they are really in tension. They have no idea what's going to happen in near future. And if this continues, our real fear is that there will be huge loss of life, and Hodeidah may become a graveyard.
And there are also concerns you have mentioned about the outbreak of disease, cholera, for instance.
Yes, already Hodeidah city is facing the food shortage. People are panic in buying, so the price is rising. The water sewage system been broken, and Hodeidah being one of the hot spot of cholera outbreak last year. If this situation continues, if people don't have food, if people don't have access to water, there will be huge malnutrition. There is no health services, and cholera will come back, and that will kill thousands of people there.
What about the humanitarian lines going into Hodeidah? Are they still being maintained at the moment?
Despite all the restrictions, the fighting on the ground, and limited functionality of the port, still the humanitarian lines continues. But the problem is, if the situation deteriorates, if the Hodeidah and Salih port does not remain functional, if the humanitarian aid agencies do not have access to operate and provide services, if their staff cannot move easily due to the intensive fighting on the ground, or even security concern, or even other bureaucratic impediments, then there will be the humanitarian space will be shrinking.
The UN envoy to Yemen has wrapped up his visit to Hodeidah. What are your hopes that perhaps the UN might be able to take control of the port?
Still, we do have a strong belief that both the parties, they will listen to the special envoy's proposition, which is basically handing over the Hodeidah port to the UN. But still, one party is saying that it's not just handing over the Hodeidah port. They also want the other party, de facto, has to fully withdraw from Hodeidah city. On this one, we did not see much progress, but we still do strongly believe that the member states and UN Security Council, they should put all measures and even maximum pressure on all the warring parties to have an immediate ceasefire, stop the fighting and plan assault on Hodeidah port, go back to the peace talks and find a political solution.
And are aid organizations such as Oxfam, your organization, preparing for the worst, perhaps, the expected offensive by the Saudis?
Yes. Oxfam and other aid agencies, including UN, we have already prepared the contingency and even response plan, and we are already responding to the affected population in some of the areas, and we also have pre-positioned items in regard to providing food, cash, and then water, health, and other nutrition services to the mobile clinics. And the humanitarian agencies, they're working together to ensure that the affected populations are served. However, we are really, really concerned about the humanitarian space. We need safe passage for our staff to move freely to provide this aid.
Okay, Muhsin Siddiqui, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, in Canada, 33 people have died from heat-related complications in the province of Quebec. 18 of the deaths occurred in Montreal, where the temperature on Thursday was expected to climb to 45 degrees Celsius with humidity. The city's public health department says most of those who died were men between the ages of 53 and 85 who lived on the upper floors of apartment buildings without air conditioning. Heat warnings are in effect across southern Quebec, Ontario and the Atlantic Group region on the country, but temperatures are expected to soon drop. The record-breaking heat wave began on the 29th of June. At least 24 people have been killed in explosions at a fireworks factory in Mexico. Most of them died in the initial blast, which brought emergency workers rushing to the scene. Several firefighters and police officers were killed in that explosion that followed. The government has introduced regulations to make the industry safer, but this factory was unlicensed and did not follow safety standards. Well, share bikes have been getting a bad name over widespread dumping, and Melbourne has now imposed fines of $3,000 a bike. That's seen O-Bike pull out of the city, leaving angry customers demanding their deposits back. Adding to its woes, O-Bike in Singapore has gone into liquidation, raising questions over the viability of the bike share model. More from Sulan.
Share bikes have become an eyesore in various Australian cities and a target for vandals. Now, one popular firm, O-Bike, has gone under in Singapore.
It's not unexpected. The business model the share bike operators are working on seems to be rather flawed. We're not too sure how they're actually making money and how long they can sustain their businesses.
Bikes strewn in public places have been their undoing. Overnight, the firm announced it was appointing provisional liquidators in Singapore after a crackdown on discarded bikes by local authorities. O-Bike also recently pulled out of Melbourne when council started fining companies $3,000 for each bike dumped. FTI Consulting have been appointed as liquidators to O-Bike in Singapore, but not its Australian operations. It's unclear if users will get their deposit back. Singapore customers are owed more than $6 million, and the liquidator says it will liaise with O-Bike to discuss whether it is their intention to provide such a refund. O-Bike didn't respond to calls or emails from the ABC today.
And I found it overall such an unsatisfying experience that after 2 or 3 uses of the bike, I determined that I was done with it.
Paul Hindle gave up on O-Bike last year in Sydney, but it took nearly 2 months to get his deposit back.
In my opinion, that made the biggest difference was I contacted Consumer Affairs in New South Wales. When I spoke to them, it became obvious that I wasn't the first to do so.
Rival operator Mobike has capitalised on O-Bike's woes by launching a no-deposit policy in Singapore. It says the share bike industry has huge potential in Australia, and rationalisation is a natural part of a maturing market.
They charge a very low rate for use. There's a large number of competitors in the market and a large number of bikes on the street.
There are millions of share bikes around the world, with some of the biggest firms backed by Chinese tech companies. The firms are looking at advertising and data sharing as their biggest money spinners.
The last level, which is still to be proven as really valuable, is how much you can sell your data for. So it's interesting data because it gives us information about the micro data that fill the gap between what we know about public transport.
He says for bike sharing schemes to work, then big companies need to link up with governments and local authorities.
Bigger companies, such as Didi, Uber, are able to sell the data to cities. That's a minimum involvement, which would mean that pretty much they win what they are trying to do, which is to establish some monopoly or duopolies in these cities.
But it's not just about the bikes. So these schemes are most successful where they are supported by dedicated infrastructure.
Kelly Nuttall says bikes without docking stations, that is pick-up and drop-off points, are one of the problems.
The latest stats coming out of the States is showing that although they comprise roughly about 40% of the bike sharing schemes over there, the number of trips made on dockless bikes is actually less than 10%. So it's a really fascinating thing that people are actually not choosing to use a dockless as much as the docked bikes.
Share bikes are down, but not out yet.
Well, it can be a case of who you know or who your doctor knows when it comes to accessing a clinical trial, which might just be life-saving. But the federal government wants to change that. It's funding a new app to connect patients and doctors with medical researchers in under a minute. Philippa McDonald has this exclusive report.
2 years ago, truck driver Karim Merez was given 6 months to live.
I'm a young guy and I'm strong. But I can tell you, it bring me down to my knees.
The large tumour in his chest caused by grey zone lymphoma failed to respond to 4 rounds of chemotherapy and radiation. But access to a clinical trial and a new therapy proved life-saving.
After the first cycle we had, amazingly, it all disappeared. It all melted away.
You'll see that there are numerous specialties conducting clinical trials listed.
An app like this has been available for some cancers, but with new funding this week, it's about to be extended to almost every serious medical condition. In under a minute, doctors and patients can see if clinical trials being carried out all over Australia might just be a match and offer hope.
We want to integrate clinical trials as daily practice, keeping our patients at cutting edge of medicine.
Whether it's cancer, whether it's genetic conditions, whether it's enzyme conditions, we can get patients access to medicines that would otherwise never have been available.
The app could go live as early as the end of the year, and it's among several research projects which have received a boost through the federal government's Medical Future Fund. Another is designed to boost the health of newborns by encouraging women who are having elective caesareans to wait, if it's safe to do so, until 40 weeks, instead of the average 37 weeks.
With every week a baby is safely left in the womb, it is associated with better outcomes not only in the short term, but the long term too.
It's estimated 1 in 4 babies are born before their due date as a result of a planned caesarean or induced labour. Philippa McDonald, ABC News.
Well, microplastics in our oceans and waterways is a major issue, but just how much pollution out there is unknown. A new national scheme will gather crucial data about the health of Australia's coastline, and local communities are at the centre of this project.
On the surface, Manly Cove is an idyllic Sydney scene. But dig a little deeper and you'll find it's a harbour hotspot full of plastic.
The levels we're finding, 1,200 plus pieces of microplastic in a single square metre of beach.
The Australian Microplastic Assessment Project, or AUSMAP, will document and analyse microplastic pollution around the country.
It's a citizen science project that we're engaging the local people, the local communities of areas and the local school children to be able to collect this data for us.
Knowledge is power, and when people know this, when they see this, they will want to take action.
Ranging from 1 to 5 millimetres, microplastics can be seen with the naked eye. Community groups will be trained to collect the data using scientific methods. The Manly Strauchlers hope to bring greater awareness to the issue.
The tide is turning on items like straws, people are becoming more aware of them. But when it comes to issues like microplastic, there's still a lot of education that's needed.
One goal is to identify the source of the plastics.
We can potentially go back to local government and also to the specific industries that are making these plastic products and see if we can get some changes happening there.
From micro things, big things grow. Antoinette Collins, ABC News, Sydney.
Let's go to sport now, and Australia has dropped its first match of the T20 International Tri-Series, losing to Pakistan by 45 runs in Harare. Australia won the toss and elected to bowl as Jai Richardson picked up a wicket with his first ball. Despite the early setback, Pakistan got on top of the pace bowlers before the part-time spin of Glenn Maxwell got the breakthrough. Zaman struck a hard-hitting 73 and Andrew Tai finished with 3 wickets as Pakistan posted 7 for 194 off its 20 overs.
Bang! That has gone over the commentary box here at the golf course end.
The Australians made a steady start to their run chase before a cluster of top-order wickets fell in quick succession. Even with some late-order hitting, they fell well short of the victory target. Pakistan and Australia have already progressed to the final of the tournament. They'll be played on Sunday. And the Australians have continued their good form at Wimbledon with 5 singles players through to the third round. Nick Kyrgios, Alex de Minaur and Matt Ebden progressed while Bernard Tomic lost in 4 sets. In the women's draw, Ashley Barty and Daria Gavrilova have made it to the last 32.
Nick Kyrgios won in straight sets, but as always, it wasn't straightforward.
That's what he has to do. He can't call it before you hit it.
The 23-year-old was happy to be given a demonstration of the foot fault rule, but less pleased when a linesman's report led to a code violation for swearing.
You seem very upset about the code violation for a little.
Not upset at all.
We spoke to the umpire while the Mexican wave was going on for quite some time.
Does that make me upset?
Well, you also had a word with the line judge as well.
Does that make me upset?
Okay, were you upset?
No.
After defeating Dutchman Robin Haase, Kyrgios made it clear that he prefers to do his entertaining on the court rather than in media conferences.
Is it also for you important to have that fun on court?
Very important.
The next opponent for Kyrgios will be Kei Nishikori, who saw off a spirited challenge from Bernard Tomic. In his Wimbledon debut, Australian teenager Alex de Minaur booked a third-round date with the world #1, Rafael Nadal.
Yeah, I know him. He's good, he's young and he's dangerous.
At 30 years old, Matt Ebden's ranked a career-high 51 and into the third round of a Grand Slam for the first time.
Matthew Ebden continuing the great form of Australia.
There was more good news in the women's draw, with Ashley Barty beating Canada's Eugenie Bouchard in a battle of 2 former Wimbledon junior champions.
Oh, we're seeing everything on court at the moment.
And Daria Gavrilova recorded a convincing win over countrywoman Sam Stosur. Both of the third seeds, Garbina Muguruza and Marin Cilic, bowed out in the second round. Duncan Huntsdale, ABC News.
Well, Brisbane Broncos veteran Sam Thaiday has announced his retirement from the NRL in unique fashion. The 33-year-old dressed as an old man while visiting a retirement village and announced that he will be finishing up at the end of the season.
To be honest, this is probably a true reflection on how I've been feeling over the last couple of seasons. I feel old, sore, tired and definitely balding as well.
Thaiday began his career at the Broncos in 2003. He played almost 300 games for the club, 29 matches for the Maroons, and 32 tests for Australia. Well, champion V8 supercars driver Craig Lowndes has announced he'll be retiring at the end of the year. The 44-year-old will step down from full-time racing and dropped the news ahead of this weekend's V8 race in Townsville.
I can say with a heavy heart this has been the hardest decision that myself and the team have had to make. Thank you to all that have stood by me through my career, personally and professionally.
Lowndes has notched up more than 100 race wins from 650 starts during his 22-year career. He'll continue as co-driver for endurance events. Well, a West Australian fisherman has had a very lucky escape. He was saved from the seas by a volunteer marine rescue crew which just happened to be nearby. The crew had been out supporting a team of long-distance rowers when they spotted the one lone fisherman and his capsized dinghy just as they turned around to head home.
The boat's skipper first spotted a flare, then smoke. In the water, a man shivering and clinging to his dinghy.
We'll get you on board, then we'll start your boat.
The recreational crayfisher was pulling his pots when his small dinghy capsized. He'd been wearing a life jacket but took it off to dive under his upturned boat to retrieve his flares.
Yeah, I'm right, mate. You're right.
Geraldton Marine Rescue volunteers were only out on the water to escort a team of long-distance rowers. They were starting to turn back when they spotted the flares.
Today you'd struggle to see the flares from the land just because of the haze on the water. He was getting ready for a long stay in the water, so he was pretty glad to see us. Couldn't thank us enough to be there.
Well, I knew someone would come eventually, but it was getting a bit cold.
Murray's wife was on shore and preparing to call emergency services when he was spotted.
To be letting a flare off at that instance, it's 1,000 to 1 chance that we would actually get to see that flare, and it happened today that we did.
The craze may have got away, but help arrived just in time. Cecile O'Connor, ABC News, Geraldton.
And before we go, recapping our top stories, rescue teams in Thailand are working against the clock to save 12 boys and their soccer coach from a flooded cave. Worsening weather and falling oxygen levels are complicating the operation, and one volunteer diver has died during the rescue mission. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has met with North Korean officials amid concerns the North is upgrading its nuclear capability. And rescue teams in Thailand are still searching for 23 people missing after a boat capsized in rough seas near Phuket. And that's all for The World for tonight. Mimi Kwa will bring you the latest ABC headlines in just a few minutes. I'm Girish Sawlani. Have a great weekend.